Hi, good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I've been researching COVID since early 2020, focused on autoimmunity as the primary pathophysiology, and it has allowed me to look at the pandemic through a very unique paradigm. And as such, I'm able to see things that may easily be missed if you are not understanding the full trajectory of the pandemic. Now, this is about could the COVID vax reduce athletic performance? It's a very quick presentation tonight because it was just an interesting thing I stumbled into in part of the research. What am I researching? And just so that you're aware, coming up in the next couple of days, depending on when you've watched this or if you've gone beyond the date, you will see the link to the presentation or course is this here about vaccine-induced abnormal heart physiology and potential mechanisms. And essentially, in that presentation, what I've been looking at or what I've been focused on is trying to understand some characteristics that were noticed with regards to PET scans. And so it led me to think carefully about what were the mechanisms. So this presentation is all tied to this paper that I discussed just recently. The fact that myocardial FDG, which is glucose uptake on PET scans in asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 vaccinated and unvaccinated patients. Very important paper in my view because it points to some abnormal physiology occurring in the heart. And that's what has triggered me to be putting together this very important presentation. As I said, it's coming up in a couple of days, and it's something that I'd recommend that you look at. It's no longer free, all the free tickets are gone. There are still donation tickets left, and any donation is valued and helpful. And I just like to say thank you to all the people who have donated so far. It really is encouragement to continue doing the research. The research takes time, and you have to go through a lot to try and come to some kind of conclusion. And what has happened today is simply along that line is that as I was doing the research in preparation for this upcoming presentation and thinking about what were the mechanisms, there was a specific thing that was bugging me. I couldn't quite get to my head around it. And it was the fact that this is a before and after from the PET scans. And what you can see is these patients, they had a cohort of patients who they had a PET scan before and they had a PET scan after being vaccinated. And in these two groups here, you can see this is dark areas uptake of the labeled glucose. In both cases afterwards in the heart, this is very, very significant. And I don't think this should be overlooked. And that's what has caused me to be studying this. And it's made me realize that this could be quite a challenging Olympics in 2024. Because based on what I'm finding, if athletes have been vaccinated, there could be a transition in terms of their maximum capacity. The average person may not notice the difference, but an athlete who's pushing himself to the limit would certainly do that. And that's the other bit that I wanted to talk about. Here we have the situation, it makes you reflect on it. What was it that made Novak Djokovic missed 2 years of tournaments in the US because he refused to get it. I mean, most other people went along and said, listen, I just want to be able to perform. But he took a very clear stance that he was not doing it and he did not think it was worth the risk in his case. In truth, he has been proven right in that he had natural immunity, he had infection already, and he didn't think that there was any need for him to go about doing anything else to improve his immune system. So, what does it, however, mean for other athletes? And that's the question that I asked today. And when I had looked at the PET scan, I was scratching my head thinking, there's got to be something that compares before and after in terms of athletic performance. So I started looking. And so this I'll be covering in more detail in the presentation. So as I said, the link is in the description if you want to join us then. And this was a question that was asked all the way in 2021, in August 2021. And the title of this paper, at the time it was a preprint, it's actually now fully published since 2022. I just couldn't get the full text there. But it's a recent COVID-19 vaccination is associated with modest increases in the physiological demands to graded exercise. Technically, what they're saying is that the body is struggling to match the demands with exercise. Really, really interesting. The question is why did they do it in the first place? That's an important question. What was it that triggered them to do it? So here is the reason that they did it. You have here in the paper, it was saying it was generally recommended that all elite athletes receive all necessary vaccines prior to competition due to increased risk of viral exposure. Makes perfect sense. And they were talking about at the time the flu vaccine, which elicited a strong immune response 1 week after vaccination with no reported side effects or loss of training. However, at that time, in early 2021, the vaccines had just come out. Due to increasing reports, albeit mostly anecdotal, of adverse symptoms associated with COVID vaccines, there is a growing concern among the athletic community that vaccination may hinder athletic performance. Really good question. And you think to yourself, why didn't more people ask that question? It's such an important point. And so, what they were trying to do, as it highlights here, is that they were trying to see is such concerns could result in many athletes refusing to get vaccinated prior to competition and consequently contracted SARS-CoV-2 during upcoming major sporting events. So they really did this to reassure the athletes that, listen, don't worry, you can get the vaccine because there are no problems. And so what they did was just quite a simple exercise, and I'll cover it in more detail in the presentation if you want to join me in the few days. But here it is that they got a total of 18 athletes, mainly healthy individuals between 24 and 43, and they were looking at particular characteristics. 12 participants received the COVID vaccine during the study period, Pfizer and Johnson, and 6 were not vaccinated and were involved in a parallel study. And essentially, what they then did was they put them in a graded exercise environment, where they were going to do. I'll show you what they did so that it's here. So all the eligible participants completed a submaximal graded exercise test on a cycling ergometer, right? And so they then measured their oxygen consumptions, they did blood samples, and they then used this. So all the participants were required to complete a continuous 20-minute graded cycling exercise with multiple blood collections from an intravenous catheter. So that was a really good question. And you have to remember, they were doing this to reassure the athletes that, listen, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and get your COVID vaccine. So, as I said, I'll show you what the conclusion is because I'm not going through the full paper here. You can read it, the link is there. And essentially, what they found was that a recent COVID-19 vaccination is associated with modest increases in the physiological demands to graded exercise in non infected healthy people, but may actually improve metabolic response to exercise in those previously infected with SARS-CoV-2. Essentially, what they found was that there was a transition with regards to lower serum lactate levels. The exercise adrenaline levels were significantly lower as well. And critically, no changes in any physiological responses to exercise were found in the control participants who completed 2 bouts of exercise separately, 5 weeks without vaccination. So there is something that is occurring in the body, and we need to understand what it is. What is the mechanism? And that's kind of that curious question that I'm exploring. As I said, when I look at the hearts here, this is not normal that this happens after within a number of weeks post vaccination, where you have a change in what the heart is doing. This would therefore in practice have an impact on how the body actually functions. And that's why I said this could be a very interesting Olympics, because if the majority of participants are vaccinated, then you could see that they are not able to reach their peak athletic performance. Are really interesting. So it will only be shown in this group of athletes who are pushing themselves to the limit. And looking at whether or not records are broken could be very, very useful. There's one last secret that I'm going to be doing is that for the presentation, and I'll remind you about this presentation in case you want. For that presentation, I'm also going to collate what I found, which was marathons over the past few years, and looking at the times generally across the athletes. So join me here on Thursday, or if it's beyond Thursday, look for the link to be able to see the full presentation. And we look forward to sharing with you some really interesting thoughts. And this is what happens out of curiosity. It's only when you look at a paper, you see something you don't understand, you start to try and get to the answer. And in this case, all I was asking that made me stumble into the paper today was I was thinking that if the heart is using more glucose, is it therefore going through mitochondria, or is it becoming turning into lactate? This study suggests that it's not, and lactate is also being used by the heart, which raises a number of complex physiological questions. The good news is that if my instinct is right, there may be an answer, but you have to join the presentation to be able to see that. So, as I said, thank you very much for joining me on this. This is, as usual, an exercise in research, thinking, and trying to find solutions to problems that could be very relevant. Have a great evening and look forward to seeing you at my presentation.